Good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to our series on the political history of the United States. And, well, we're talking, of course, about the American Revolution. Uh, by the way, American victories are apparently in red, British victories are apparently in blue, and draws are purple, or things that are officially a draw. But anyway, so a lot of the colonial unrest in the wake of the intolerable acts and various anti-British sentiment, boycotts, all that stuff, it didn't leave the Crown or Parliament very happy. The British Parliament very happy, and they really kind of just sought to show the colonists who was really in control. So they ordered General Howe to march into the mostly patriot countryside of Massachusetts and let's just say that it did not end very well for the British because they went to Concord, the battles of Lexington and Concord. What happened there was that the British decided that they were going to seize the arms of patriots, or more, the American colonists who were not thrilled with the way Britain was trying to rule the colonies. And you could say, well, okay, that is... Didn't they want independence? I think some people might say. And the truth is, no, not at this point. Most of them didn't want independence. Most colonists didn't want independence at this point. However, a few were every now and then throwing around the I word. After all, we still have to remember that this is 1775 we're talking about. Continental Congress was called, and the first Continental Congress decided that, yeah, we probably should have a military, and we're going to put George Washington in charge. Now, there were a few key generals that we're going to wind up talking about. There's, of course, George Washington. There's Horatio Gates, at least American generals. The British, they had too many commanders to really talk about because, well, the British had Lincoln syndrome, and I'll explain what Lincoln syndrome is when we get to the American Civil War. But the American generals we're going to talk about are Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, and Nathaniel Greene when we get down here, as well as later on Colonel, or as they would have said back then, Colonel Daniel Morgan, and I'll talk why I really like Morgan. And I may talk about some of the foreign volunteers, as well as maybe one or two of the French commanders, or more accurately, the French aid that we got. So, after Lexington and Concord, nothing really happened, surprisingly, for some time. simply because the colonists, the Patriots, we'll call them the Continental Militia, specifically Massachusetts Militia, but later on the first iteration of the Continental Army, which the United States Army actually celebrates its birthday in 1775, which is not wrong. It is correct. The U.S. Army was conceived in 1775. Anyway, they surrounded the city of Boston, where the British forces, the regulars, were located. And they laid siege to Boston. And at this point, any Patriot supporters that were still in Boston were either evicted or taken prisoner. And Boston became kind of a loyalist city at this point. Eventually, General Henry Knox, along with Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen from Vermont, they go up to a place called Fort Ticonderoga. Well, Arnold and Allen go there, right? And they capture Fort Ticonderoga. And Henry Knox, he does a pretty Herculean task back then in the dead of winter over snow and ice and mud. He takes some massive guns from Fort Ticonderoga, which is, it's in Vermont, New York area, up in kind of this part, near Burlington, Vermont. Anyway, they take those guns to siege Boston. Washington, who is now in Massachusetts, sets them up on Bemis Heights. Sorry, not Bemis Heights. Whoops. Sets them up on some bluffs overlooking, not bluffs, but some hills overlooking Boston. And this triggers the British to abandon Boston. Now you're going to wonder why I didn't talk about Bunker Hill, and that's basically to say that Bunker Hill was actually kind of inconsequential. Everybody talks about it because of the whole don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, and the whole, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British because they did eventually take the hill. The truth is, it didn't matter in the long run, other than the fact that the British lost so many men, including commanders. And that was actually something that the British really hated about the American method of warfare, was that the Americans didn't really care if you were low-ranking or high-ranking. They were going to shoot at you regardless, and we'll talk a little bit about that more as we go on. The British were very much not in the mood to shoot commanders. They didn't see it as an honorable way of waging war. Now, in New England, the thing that typically happened when you went to war was you got your militia together and you went and invade Canada. And Benedict Arnold and a lot of the Massachusetts militia did that too, going up through Maine and eventually into Quebec. And they win a battle in Montreal, but they lose in Quebec City as well as in between the two on the St. Lawrence River. Also, we have to remember that it was in the dead of winter when they went to Quebec and Montreal. The British decide to launch a multi-pronged invasion of New York as fighting actually started happening uh, in New York as well, because very early on in the war, the fighting goes and moves to New York and the Middle Colonies, including, and most of it's in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And believe it or not, most of the fighting does not happen in New England where the conflict starts. Most of it doesn't happen in the deep, deep South. Most of it happens in the time frame most of it happens in the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. New York is captured by the British, and that's kind of a big blow. And one thing that the British want to do is, to put it lightly, they want to separate the colonies by taking over the entire Hudson River. And effectively that would cut off supply and communication lines, because the British Navy controls the oceans at this time frame. And they send a few generals down. And in 1777, well, let's just say that, well, let's rewind just a touch, because in the dead of winter in Pennsylvania, Washington's troops are wintering in Valley Forge for the first time in a brutal cold winter. They then cross the Delaware River into New Jersey in the dead of night on Christmas and attack some Hessian mercenaries Brits hired who are stationed at Trenton. The Americans don't really suffer any casualties. By the way, casualty is a severe injury or death, not just a death. Numbers are almost always, for American casualties, are almost always single figures. And the best one, and of course no Americans died from any records that I've found. The notable casualty in this battle was actually James Monroe getting hit with a musket ball in the arm. And that arm that he was hit in was perpetually shorter than the other from that point on. Anyway, back to New York. The Americans planned a fight and retreat to more defensible ground. And the Americans brought in a Polish engineer. Anybody who saw my video on Tadeusz Kościuszko will know who he is. And, of course, we have to talk about the Battle of Saratoga and Bemis Heights. Saratoga was, to say the least, it was a decisive battle, to put one point, to make it easy for everyone. Basically, the Americans fortified a bunch of hills, and the British just couldn't take the fortified positions. The other advantage that the Americans had was we had sharpshooters and the Brits didn't. And this is where Daniel Morgan starts to come in. He had the idea to get some crack shots from the backwoods of basically everywhere. But some of the people he recruited actually lived kind of in, they lived in the New River Valley near the Proclamation Line, which actually runs along the Continental Divide and the Appalachians in this area. And fun fact, I live about 10 miles from the Proclamation Line. And yeah. So that's one thing for my area to be proud of, is we had Daniel Morgan sharpshooters. Eventually, Benedict Arnold, after a bit of a disagreement with General Horatio Gates, decides, I'm attacking. And he attacked the British positions. And surprise, surprise, the Americans won that one. And General Burgoyne, who is the commander of troops in that theater, surrendered the entire army, and that really took fighting out of New York and more into Pennsylvania, New Jersey. As you can see, the war is moving further and further south. And 1777 was pretty much a big year for the war. And you can also notice there aren't a ton of battles, and there's a good reason for that. Armies were small. The continent, the American colonies were extremely vast. Even the small ones in that era were vast. And it took a lot of time to actually get somewhere. So when troops ran into each other, it was kind of surprising. You had a general idea of where they were, but not a very specific one. So when you moved somewhere, the other army had moved somewhere else. Right? And after Saratoga, which was a major victory, the French pledged official support. Now we do have to go backwards in time a little bit to 1776. Eventually, things turn around, and olive branch petition is rejected, and it takes a lot of wrangling and negotiating in the Continental Congress in order to get a motion for independence passed. Right? And you can actually watch that. I highly recommend watching the series John Adams. It's available for those who have Amazon Prime or HBO. Actually, you need HBO to watch it, if I remember correctly. It's a very good series. There are a few gripes I have about it, but overall, it is a very good series. It covers everything important. And it actually has some cool historical trivia in it as well. For example, it is absolutely correct when it says that Thomas Jefferson had invented the swivel chair. See, I swivel. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson, for that. And it's a very good show, and it kind of shows the political wrangling. It was basically Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina that were the difficult colonies in getting a vote for independence. The New England colonies basically followed Massachusetts' lead. Maryland, Delaware, and to an extent New Jersey took Virginia's lead. You would think New Jersey would take Pennsylvania's lead, but even back then, New Jersey was kind of, no, we hate Pennsylvania, we hate New York, we hate being sandwiched by two powerful states. South Carolina is just South Carolina. Georgia and North Carolina also took Virginia's lead. And after a bunch of battles, including the oppressively hot Monmouth Courthouse battle, the theater again switched to the deep, deep, deep South. Oh, and there was one battle, I want to say it was the Battle of Princeton. Another Pole managed to basically keep Washington and the Continental Army alive. And Washington granted this pole a a cavalry regiment or division, whatever you want to call it. And he tried to turn them into lancers. Now, a lancer is kind of outdated even by 1770 standards. And what I mean by a lancer is basically just a mounted soldier, a mounted combatant who carries a giant lance that basically jousting, but in combat. Yeah, you can see how that's kind of an outdated idea by the 1770s. Truthfully, it was outdated in the 1670s. But hey, the Poles have that whole history with the winged hussars. So go figure that a Polish volunteer would try and bring that to the American military. And of course, this volunteer's name is Kazimierz Pulaski, or as we would say in the States, Casimir Pulaski, or Pulaski, depending on where you're from. There's a county in my area where everybody says Pulaski, so that's the way I've said it for a while now. His cavalry regiment pretty much got wiped out at Savannah when they tried to retake the city. Now, we go down south, and truthfully, the British held the South for most of the war. When the theater switched, then of course the South was also a little bit more loyalist friendly, except in the backwoods. And the backwoods were really, really crazy. Now, Continental Congress sent Horatio Gates at first to try and retake some of the major ports down south, like Wilmington and Charleston and Savannah. But Horatio Gates did not do very well. Nathaniel Greene had a much different strategy. First, he would split his force between himself and Daniel Morgan. Second, his forces would travel as light as possible so that they could cover more ground every single day. And their goal was to lead the British on a fight and retreat to the Dan River in Virginia in order to regroup with the main contingent of the Continental Army and then march back down south again. And this required a few things. Number one, every now and then it did require an American victory, so that key points and lines of travel were still available. Second, it required inflicting enough British casualties in order to get them to try to focus somewhere else and to eventually surrender and wear down. The other plan the colonists had was, and the Americans at this point, the other plan they had was to basically make the war drag out for so long that Parliament got tired and would vote to end it, overruling the king. So, South Carolina had, well, at this point, one major battle. The Battle of Cowpens. Kings Mountain was also somewhat significant, but not nearly as much as Cowpens, where Daniel Morgan had his Continental Army forces and militia forces together. Now, a lot of people and a lot of Americans over-romanticize, and it even happened immediately after the Revolution, but they overemphasize the role of militia. Most historical sources and most commanding officers in both the British and the American army, they did not like the militias, the Continental militias. The regulars, the American regulars, the Continental Army was much more effective than the colonial militias. Daniel Morgan knew this, so he told the militia, advance on British positions, fire twice, give them 2 good shots, and then you can go home. Most didn't even give him 2 shots, but it was enough to fool the British into thinking it was just a militia force. They charged, come over a hill, and what do they find? But half the damn Continental Army. And the Brits get overrun. Now, this particular British force was led by a guy whose nickname is Bannister the Butcher. His name was Bannister Tarleton. And yeah, he earned Bannister the Butcher. So anyway, after some rather embarrassing defeats in the South, as well as the fact that the Continentals, the Americans, were reinforcing in Virginia, he decided to take up a strong position at the port of Yorktown, especially when they heard rumors that there was a French military force that was going to be coming in. And that was correct. The Marquis de Lafayette had a small force with him. Washington had united his troops with a General Rochambeau. And on the seas, de Grasse had actually managed to win a battle against the Brits in the ocean, on the seas, and defeat the British Navy. And that was the Battle of Virginia Capes. And that keeps a British relief force out of Yorktown, which by this point is under siege. Now, the war is already incredibly unpopular in Britain. It's likely unpopular with most of the American population, but it's also not as unpopular as it is in Britain, because it's happening on American soil, and the Americans are actually looking like they could win at this point. At least if you were looking at it from the narrative perspective. But the reality of the situation is that the Brits had actually abandoned most of the colonies by this point. So, the French surround the Brits from the sea. All land escape is cut off by the American forces, and you have the American and French coalition slowly advancing on Yorktown. Building their trench networks and slowly advancing them, taking over redoubts 9 and 10, and eventually winning. And this is the point at which Cornwallis surrenders, not to Washington, as a famous painting depicts, but Cornwallis actually surrenders officially before a subordinate officer of Washington's. And that's actually the way it happened most of the time in war, is a subordinate for one officer would surrender to the subordinate of another general in battles like this. Very rarely would a general surrender to another general. So, after the war, of course, you have the treaty that you have to look at. The French managed to get in a provision that allowed them to take back Louisiana, the entire Louisiana territory, or and a few other nations had joined in. The Spanish, the Spanish, the Dutch had also joined in. Sorry, the Spanish got Louisiana, who they would later lose in the very early parts of the Napoleonic Wars. They would lose out very early on to France. The French, I'm trying to remember what they got in return for their aid to the Americans. The Americans obviously got our independence here in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. We got all of present-day New York, Vermont, though Vermont was doing its own weird thing. All of present-day New Hampshire, most of present-day Maine, you'd argue all of it. We just had some disputes. And actually, Maine was part of Massachusetts at this point. We got everything up to the Great Lakes, so everything on the border of Lake Erie. We got Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula, so basically everything south of the Great Lakes. And everything east of the Mississippi River, save for parts of the Spanish territory around New Orleans. Now, the dividing line would be the 49th parallel, wherever the Mississippi crossed the 49th parallel. We'll explain why that didn't quite work out some other time, but this video is kind of long enough, and we've completed the revolution. You have a test on this on Monday, of course. Enjoy your weekends and have a very nice day. Likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help, and I greatly appreciate them. And a subscription to my Patreon would be cool. And the mock government is now in session, and there's a link to that in the description as well. Thank you very much. Have a very nice evening. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.